Welcome to another episode of the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Menna. Today we have a special episode about Palestine. This is part of a longer series. If you haven't watched some of the older ones that have come out this week and the weeks prior, please go check them out. Our guest today is Nadi Abusaada, who is an architect and historian currently at ETH Zurich. Nadi, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mikey. It's good to see you.
Today is October 28th. We're recording this at 10:42 a.m. Palestine time, just to give people context about what's going on, since it's a day-by-day situation. Nadi, you and I met a couple years ago, and I've wanted to have you on the series for a while because we don't get a chance to speak to so many people who are thinking about architecture, and I don't know if urban planning is the right terms, but basically thinking about the built world and sort of the way humans interact with the world around them and the buildings around them, and how that shapes society. And in particular, I feel like society and life in Palestine is so deeply misunderstood that you are an interesting person to speak to right now to give context about the history and how our understanding of life and the land in Palestine has sort of changed over time. So what I'd love to do is start by having you just explain to a layman, yani me, what you think you do and how it relates to what's happening today in Palestine.
Thanks, Mikey, for the quite polemic question. Actually, for me, I mean, what I can say is that I started as an architect. So I started as, someone from the Arab world with a desire to study and work in architecture. And by architecture, I mean actual design of buildings. But it soon after starting this, I think I realized that we are at a point in the Arab world where we can decide either to jump straight into practice or to pause a little and try to think of where are we actually in terms of architecture and urban planning in Palestine, but also in the Arab world with large. So that sort of took me in a whole another journey to start writing the history and theory really of architecture and cities in the region. I started with Palestine, and one of the main questions that came to me, I mean, I'm someone who grew up in Palestine, and so to me there was an immediate familiarity with the architecture in Palestine. Right? At the same time, when I was reading all these books being written about the architecture of Palestine abroad, most of the focus was on the architecture of occupation. I think, obviously, I mean, only the past 2 weeks, we have immediate evidence of why it's important to understand the architecture of occupation, meaning how the occupation utilizes spatial tools and instruments in order to oppress people. And we've seen this happen not only the past 2 weeks, not even for the past 75 years, but since the first Jewish colonies were built in Palestine for the purpose of settler colonialism. So all the way back to the 1880s. So my purpose, at least during working on the PhD, was to try and understand what were Palestinians doing at this same time. So at the same time that Jewish colonialism was increasing in Palestine, at the same time that the British rule started in 1917 onwards, what were the Palestinians doing? Were they just merely reacting to colonialism? Or did they have visions of their own when it comes to understanding, but also constructing their building? I would say that's sort of the start of this question for me.
Was it a question that you had like a hunch about? Or was it you had a hunch about the answer, or were you like, Why is no one even asking this question?
That's also a good question. I think I had the hunch. Well, I'll tell you where the hunch came from. We're talking about a country that is thousands of years old. In the history of architecture, when we wanted to talk about the architecture of Palestine, we're talking about a history that stretches back all the way to antiquity, right, until the present. It couldn't have been possible for someone like me to imagine that all we have to say about our history is what has been done to us. The colonialism, it hasn't been too long. I mean, 100 years is long in the lifetime of humans, right? But it's not in the lifetime of cities and the lifetime of architecture. So what I wanted to understand is that there must have been another history to this period of extreme violent intervention and colonialism in Palestine. And that's what turned out to be the case.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about maps and the way we think about the world, right? So much of what we reference when we talk about Palestine in 2023 is referencing all these maps, right? We talk about maps all the time. Even we tattoo them on ourselves and we wear them around our neck, and we define ourselves with these straight lines that were created relatively recently, right? So in your research, how has the map of Palestine shifted over time? And I don't mean over the last since 1967. I'm not talking about that contraction and that type of erasure, colonizing erasure. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about pre-World War I. How has it sort of shifted?
I think one thing to keep in mind here is that maps don't simply represent geography. Maps invent geography. They create, they construct, right? I mean, a map is never an actual depiction of geography. And I think this seems very basic, but I think it's important to iterate.
Yeah.
As far as Palestine is concerned, actually mapping has been, and cartography with large has been one of the instruments of imperial control. I say imperial and not necessarily just when it comes to settler colonialism and even British colonialism, but even since the late Ottoman period. I mean, Palestine at the time is still under Ottoman rule, yet you already have something like the British Exploration Fund, the Palestine Exploration Fund, which is a British-run organization, operated in Palestine as early as the 1860s. And so that's a subtle way in which European powers start to have a foot in Palestine, obviously under the banner of science.
Yeah.
But in reality, all of these efforts turned out to be useful, actually, for the later, when the British would come and invade Palestine in 1917, they relied on these maps that were produced earlier to understand the geography, but also to conquer it.
Yeah. You know, I find there's this like heartbreaking irony when I live like so many people on social media. And there's heartbreaking irony when people post photos online of, pre-colonial Palestine, and underneath it says like credit Palestine Exploration Fund. And it took, I didn't grow up knowing that term, Palestine Exploration Fund, right? And it's a heartbreaking story. I mean, it's so insidious. So for people who don't know, tell us a little bit of the history of the Palestine Exploration Fund and what its stated purposes were, maybe versus its intended effects.
Yeah. So for the Palestine Exploration Fund specifically, I mean, the main thing was archaeology. The main purpose, stated purpose at least, was archaeology. Of course, we need to understand that when it comes to 19th century British Empire, it's never just archaeology. I mean, especially with Palestine, where there was this biblical charge, if you want, if we can call it that way. I mean, Palestine got a lot of attention, right? I mean, there were British archaeologists, but there were also German archaeologists in Palestine. And obviously, these people came on a mission. They were professionals, so they were trained as archaeologists and came with the real purpose of doing archaeological work. But to what end is the question, right? And there's no doubt that this archaeological work came hand in hand with British imperial efforts to expand into the Middle East, and obviously including Palestine. And this became very, very evident in 1917 when the British troops, the first British troops arrived in Palestine actually through Gaza. So they came from Egypt and drove north into Gaza. Now, one thing I think, just to go back to your question about maps and this whole world of Palestine around World War One. Actually, one thing to note is that Palestine, or the Palestine Front in World War One, was one of the main sites where there was developments, significant developments in the science of cartography. So in the World War One, you get the first war in the world's history, essentially, where aerial power is as important as ground troops, right? So there's a lot of basically missions for aerial photography that play a major role in the war. And it was in Palestine where the first attempts to draw maps out of aerial images took place. There was a British officer, his name is Captain Hamshall Thomas. He was a professor at Cambridge, actually, and he was present there on the Palestine front. And that's where he started using these aerial images to produce maps. So again, this idea of images, but also maps being not merely neutral depictions of the landscape, but rather tools that abstract this landscape into certain features that you can then not only understand and analyze, but also conquer.
Yeah. So in this case, the maps were never an anthropological exercise. They were always the development of a military tool.
In for the most part, I would say.
Can I ask you, at that point, this like Palestine front, and going back to your original sort of thesis that you were talking about, what sort of agency did Palestinians have, indigenous Palestinians of all shapes and sizes, for lack of a better term, all over Palestine? What agency did they have? And in what role did they play in this map making and a development of the built landscape?
Yeah, so I would talk a little bit about the pre-war period, because in the war, I mean, obviously Palestinians some of them would be conscripted into the Ottoman army. Some joined the Arab Revolt. So you have various ways of involvement in the war effort. But up until that point, some Palestinians were actually involved in the Palestine Exploration Fund. So there are records of Arabs and Palestinians being employed by the Palestine Exploration Fund, either as translators or even as archaeologists. So it's important to keep in mind that the history of colonialism is never purist, in the sense that it never only relies on foreign expertise. The local expert starts to emerge around the same time that these colonial or foreign expertise are also arriving into the shores of the Mediterranean. And so in terms of actually the current work I'm trying to do is looking at the history of the profession of architecture in the Arab region writ large. And how do we start to have a first generation of trained Arab architects? And of course, the beginning of this in our region starts in Egypt. As early as the 1830s, we already have a school of architecture, a school of engineering, the Muhandis Khani in Egypt. And so this local expertise is really nurtured during this time already. When it comes to Palestine, I think it's a bit later that you get trained architects. I mean, you need to wait until the 1890s and early 1900s to get the first Palestinian architects. But what we need to remember here is that most architecture is built without architects, even today, right? So whether you do have the architect figure or you don't have the architect figure, you have a built environment that is expanding, that is responding to the needs of demography, that is expanding to the needs of the economy, that's responding to cultural shifts. You start getting public plazas and secular public spaces in this period. And Palestinians are financing these projects, but also managing them. This is also a time when municipalities are created in the Arab world, right? 1870s onwards, the Ottomans introduced the municipalities code. And so major cities like Jerusalem, like Jaffa, like Nablus, like Beirut, all of these cities start to get municipalities. And these were run by the local population. And their projects are basically led by the local population.
Okay, I want to ask about that. So people think that the sort of the nation state is this 20th century invention. And so I was amazed looking through your stuff, this idea that, municipalities emerged as this almost like a technology had been introduced, right? What pre-existed the municipality as a governance structure, and how did that actually change? Was it this new device?
Yeah. So it's not like, and this is an argument that Orientalists like Bernard Lewis and the such used to make, is that, Arab cities throughout the whole Ottoman era were chaotic, right?
Yeah.
That their organization didn't amount to what European sophisticated planning and administration needs, right? But in reality, there was a very robust system of administration in those cities, and that wasn't centralized in the form of a single unit of the municipality, but was actually governed through things like Sharia courts, Waqf administrations, but also, and importantly, guild systems. So they used to call them Tawa'if Hirafiyya, which is difficult to translate, but basically the guilds of the different crafts, of the different industries were
they're
very
syndicates,
organized.
basically.
Exactly. They're the pre-modern syndicates, if you wish. Where the way that the city was organized, right? And so the moment you start to get municipalities, it happens differently across different parts of the empire. So what happens in Baghdad or in Damascus isn't necessarily the same as what happens in Beirut or what happens in Jaffa. In some cases, there was an absorption into these old means of governance into the new means of governance. In other cases, it was complete rupture. It was a change that happened actually over there. And I think as historians, we should allow also for that possibility when we read and look back at history, that some moments are real moments of rupture, others aren't. So you start to get a municipal council that's essentially the head of the municipal council would be appointed from the Ottoman Empire, but all the members would be elected. Now elected by whom? Well, the elites of society, those who pay a certain number of taxes, and are males. are those who could vote. So you have a mini democracy starting to emerge in the modern sense, essentially, with the establishment of these municipalities.
How does that change, effectively, daily life of citizens and residents?
Yeah, so it really does, because I mean, suddenly you're not only accountable to systems that you're familiar with, but you're accountable to something new, to a centralized entity. So for you to build or to extend your house or to do something simple, it's not like you would just do it before without any rules. There were rules, but now the rules were different, and they've started to adhere into what in urban planning terms we understand as modern urban planning. So there's a lot of influence here of French ideas of urban planning absorbed into the Ottoman understanding of urban planning, and then absorbed into our Arab understanding of urban planning. So you get the second-hand European influence in a way over how your cities look like, over what materials you're supposed to build in, over the rules you're supposed to follow. So the built environment changes, and with it, I think new social currents start to emerge. They both influence each other. It's not like one is shaping the other alone.
Yeah, it's like, so on one hand, they're making maps that are inventing geography, right? And then on the other hand, they're like making ordinances and laws that are inventing geography as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like vernacular architecture, and how that might be different than, or let me just ask you, what is the opposite of vernacular architecture in the context of Palestine? Because I'm not sure I know the answer to that question.
Vernacular, I mean, in the simplest terms, vernacular architecture is the architecture built without the intervention of architects. So it's the architecture that is built by people. And of course, that is in the region, that is the majority of construction. And sometimes that can look like ashwaiyat, like what you see in especially in Egypt at a large scale. But it could also look like elite neighborhoods that are simply built also without architects. In the case of Palestine, I mean, it depends which period you're looking at to understand the vernacular, because technically you could still call buildings being built today without architects vernacular architecture. But if by vernacular you mean basically the traditional or historic architecture of Palestine, then I would say that the majority of the built landscape or historical built landscape of Palestine dates back to the Ottoman era. So when we look at the old cities, when we look at most of what remains of Palestinian villages in the West Bank, all of these are basically, the majority of are built during the Ottoman era, and in that sense, they're not in any way dissimilar to what you would find in Lebanon or Syria. I think these are these geographies were really intermingled, and it's hard to draw a distinction. So I mean, you get some people telling you there's a vernacular Lebanese house or vernacular Syrian house or vernacular Palestinian. I don't think these categories in architecture mean anything. I think they mean something in national terminology, but they don't mean much in architecture, actually.
Yeah. Nadi, I have a question for you, and this is very much like me asking for a friend. Like I feel like you and I are maybe similar insofar as like we're having this like super professional conversation, right? During a unbelievably heartbreaking moment, right? And there are people like every day, and I'm not Palestinian, I'm based in Beirut, but people are checking on me, and no Mikey Kifak, how are you doing? Are you holding up? Are you doing okay? And I respond by saying, and no, I'm trying to do okay. I'm one foot in front of the other. I'm, in many ways, my work feels more urgent than ever, but in other ways it feels like more meaningless. And, for what you're doing, you're Palestinian, you study, your work has to do with Palestine. All right. How are you coping? And how are you? I didn't even ask you.
Look, I think the work is in many ways is the least of my considerations, or the least things that's on my mind at the moment.
Yeah.
In full reality, like, I think there's a certain luxury with being able to zoom out and really interpret and understand the long spans of history.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's something relieving in history, because you realize that whatever you're experiencing at the moment isn't forever. I mean, when you understand that, really, and I mean it when I say that, entire empires collapsed, right? Yet Palestinians have been able to maintain their existence throughout all of these challenging moments. I think that's something in of itself, right? And it's a reminder of what is possible. But in the day-to-day, at least for the past couple of weeks, I mean, to me, I haven't even thought about work. Yeah, until now, really. And yeah, I think you find solace in community, in being able to see that there is a real solidarity taking place at the moment. In many ways, I think the current moment filtered out who you really need to have on your side, and who you really don't. People with double standards, people who are unable to be consistent about their support for humanity and for the fight against colonialism. I think this moment is devastating. This moment also clarified a lot of things. Not so much within Palestine, because in Palestine, I think things have always been clearer than outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I personally feel that same pruning of my social circles, because it's just like, it's miraculous, not miraculous, astounding, I should say, how many double standards there are. But when we go back to the work, does it feel related? And like, there's an article that you wrote about stones in Jerusalem, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. It's a word I don't know how to pronounce, stereonomy or something like that. Stereotomy. Yes. Mm-hmm. When that article is as successful as it was, right? Like, a lot of people seem to have connected with it. Do you feel like, and you guys don't know what I'm talking about, this is all part of the same problem. This wasn't like a cute little academic exercise. I'm talking about a deeper injustice here. Does it feel like it's completely disconnected? Like the profession at large is not even making these connections?
Absolutely. And I think this is important. I think what I'm realizing is that people like to write, and this includes architects and includes non-architects, but I think the academic field writ large loves to talk about colonialism when it's over, when there's no cost to writing and talking about colonialism. And so people will create all these syllabuses with these, leftist writings from the 60s, the Battle
from
of
Franz
Algiers,
Fanon
the Fanon and Said, and, but as long as it doesn't have to do with the present, as long as it's something in the past that we could make a career out of, sorry, this is quite brutal, but it's, in my opinion, the truth. Then only then is it meaningful to talk about it. And to me, that's actually the quite opposite of what should be happening. I think there's a certain responsibility that academics should take on to respond not only to finished events, although I don't think they're really finished, but to the present, right? And historians, I think, have a double responsibility to do that. Yet in Western academia, this does not seem to be the case. And I think that's the most frustrating part, and not only for me, but I think in any of us, Palestinian or Arab or even pro-Palestine, operating in these Western institutions at the moment, to see really no ability to have a spine, to stand for justice in the present, only when, as Muhammad Kurd once put it, when it's no longer necessary, right? So I think that's the important thing to keep in mind at this moment when it comes to academia.
What is the reception among your colleagues of when you express those sentiments? And let me ask you, let me ask them in two different groups. Colleagues, or three different groups. Colleagues and no, people who at your similar level of tenure, or years, maybe tenure is not the right word because it's but years spent in the profession. That's one group. The second group is your students, and the third group are your senior colleagues. What is the reception?
Yeah. So I think the answer to this question would differ extremely across different geographies. And to me, I'm now working in a Swiss institution, and this is a new context for me. Last year I was in the US, it was very different. Before that in the UK, it was also very different. As far as Switzerland is concerned, I think there's this aura, or all engulfing feeling of, Switzerland is neutral. It's a country without colonies. It's a country that doesn't have that history. It's a country that can maintain its objectivity in all such conditions. But I think that's completely false. And I think the past 2 weeks are yet another evidence that this is completely false. Switzerland just cut funding to 11 Palestinian organizations operating either within 48 or in the West Bank. It also abstained when a ceasefire was in question at the Security Council, right? So Switzerland is far from actually a neutral state. In terms of reception in my current environment, I would say there's been a lot of disappointments, to say the least. Students at the moment, there hasn't been any interaction with students on this yet. But in terms of tenured faculty taking up a real stance and a real position, there have been a few exceptions of people I really respect and admire who took the right stance from the beginning. But I would say that others are very disappointed.
Yeah.
I'll leave it vague.
Yeah, I understand. Let me ask you a different question. Let me ask, do you feel like the work you're doing is in direct solidarity with this issue? Like I said, for example, like I feel my work is simultaneously more urgent, but meaningless. Do you feel your work is more urgent than ever?
I think two things here. I think that solidarity, I mean, this is, for me, it's my cause, right? So in a sense, any cause that is Palestinian, that is Arab, is, to me, at least in my own belief system, is inherently mine. And is something that I work towards. And I think that's echoed, or I tried my best to echo that in my work, whether a crisis is happening or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise I could have just went and designed beautiful buildings. But that to me is really pointless at this point. That's not where I find I can contribute some. Part of the battle or arena that I've chosen for myself, at least until now, has been this question of histories, but also narratives. How do we understand the past? What does this past tell us about the present? Because, I mean, a lot of the questions that we ask about the past have a lot more to do with the present than they have to do with history, actually. They tell us more about the current moment than they tell us about what happened before.
Yeah.
So there's this question of why are we asking these questions in this particular moment? And I do sincerely believe that, at least since the Arab Spring, we've seen a desire by people from our region to pose new kinds of questions about the past. And I think I see myself as a small part of this broader wave.
Yeah.
So that's how I position it at least for me.
So let's say you were speaking to an auditorium filled with architects who care about Palestine, whether they're Arab, Palestinian, not, doesn't matter, but they are listening to this, and it's a auditorium filled with 100 of these architects, young and old. What are the like questions that you hope that they are asking? Whether you have time to answer them yourself, but you're like, can somebody look into this? Please, like I'm doing my small part. I need other people to do their small parts. Like, what are the questions that not enough people are asking?
Yeah. So I as far as the profession is concerned, so as far as architecture specifically is concerned, I am finding that a lot of young people and people who are just graduating right now tend to escape from architecture. And I think so they study architecture and they leave it. And I think this phenomena is happening because of the nature of our education systems and architecture being completely outdated. But I think more importantly, not only being outdated, but being irrelevant. So students are being taught to think about things that do not match the realities they live in, right? I think otherwise. I think that there is a chance here to use our profession to really interpret reality and intervene in. I don't think the tools that architecture trains you in are to be underestimated. At the same time, we shouldn't overestimate ourselves.
Can you give me an example? Yeah. What are some of these tools that are some people underestimate, but you're like, no, these are relevant tools, and in what ways are they actually relevant?
Yeah, I mean, for instance, the mere documentation of the built environment and understanding it, to me, is a huge thing that is today necessary in Palestine and the Arab region. And that's why we're seeing the surge of initiatives by architects that are trying to work outside private firms, but also outside academia, to try and actually document our built environment. Because at the same time that our cities are being destroyed, I think documenting them is not merely about romanticizing these cities and, they used to be beautiful, etc. It's not about that. But it's about an inherent part of our history is actually our cities. The way we build is a direct reflection of the kinds of societies that we want to organize. So in that sense, documenting, analyzing, understanding these built environments is also about understanding our societies, it's understanding our cultures, and even understanding politics.
Yeah.
Because there's what you do and there's what's done to you. And both of these things are measured in spatial terms, are things you can actually go on the ground and draw and survey them. So I would say that is an important tool. I would say there's something at a more polemic level. There's something about architecture that is about bringing in different tools and modes of knowledge into understanding phenomena. So I don't think any good architect is merely an architect. I think a good architect is someone who reads philosophy, who reads politics, who's socially engaged, who understands culture and art, right? So I think the moment you're able to bring all of these understandings together is the moment that you truly master the craft of architecture. Whether you decide to be an architect, design, or you do something else with that.
Yeah.
So I think these are the questions of what can we do at this particular moment? How can we use our knowledge towards the betterment of our societies? I think is the central question.
I want to ask you like I don't know how I'm going to ask this question, but I saw a video today, The Guardian posted, that shows insane amount of destruction in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a before and after, all this aerial footage of Gaza. And in some ways, it's effective. The aerial vantage point is supremely effective in dehumanizing the space, right? It's a two-dimensional, looks entirely two-dimensional. There are no people in the before, there are no people in the after, and it's just squares that look like buildings and then gray rubble everywhere. So the questions are, the first question is, where does The Guardian get that footage? That's my first one. Whose satellite imagery is taking live feeds of Palestine? And is this like a military feed that The Guardian has access to? That's the first question. That's weird. Like, because the aerial footage that you're referencing was paid by the military, I would imagine. And then the second question, which is harder to ask, is how do these buildings and neighborhoods get rebuilt? I mean, how are they paid for? How do they get rebuilt? How do families reassemble and societies reassemble after such an insane, heartless bombardment?
In terms of the imagery, I think it's important to distinguish between aerial imagery and satellite imagery, right? And I did not see these Guardian photos, but I'm assuming they're probably satellite imageries which people could purchase. I mean, they're not live. I don't think we're there yet. But I mean, there are snapshots taken at particular intervals in time, either monthly or weekly or daily, depending on the satellite and who has access to it. As for the second question, which is the question of reconstruction, I think, I mean, it's to me, it's really difficult at this very moment to delve into that question, precisely because the destruction is still happening. I think in the history of Gaza, in the history of cities from World War II until this moment, and I say World War II because that's the moment where aerial bombardment becomes the true force in war. In in this case, in our case, in genocide. We've seen, I mean, entire destructions of cities, whether in Europe, whether you talk about Dresden or any other European city that got heavily bombarded in World War II, up until to what we were seeing in Syria not too long ago. And obviously Gaza for the past 15 years of subsequent wars, where aerial power and aerial bombing has become this simple and easy tool for the complete destructions of the lives of hundreds of thousands and millions. And I mean, we're seeing today the whole conversation about whether the Israeli army is able to make a ground incursion or not in Gaza. And it's proven much more difficult for them than an aerial bombardment. I think for some obvious reasons. But in terms of how cities get rebuilt, well, cities have an enormous and actually very impressive ability to get rebuilt. The gates of Gaza have seen conquerors from Alexander the Great to Napoleon, to the armies of Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt, to the British troops who came in 1917. The city is still there, and it survives. And I think that's what's important to keep in mind, is that it survives because of its people. It survives because of its Palestinian population who lives there, and have the attachment to this land that's rightly their homeland, and as a result are able to rebuild after this mass destruction. I think it says a lot. It says a lot just to look and observe about, or just to look and observe who's the force of destruction here, and who is really trying to build their futures, to build their hopes, to build their visions, or for a just and dignified reality.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you for recommendations for people who are interested in understanding some of the infrastructure of both, not only in Palestine, but how infrastructure can be used as a tool of oppression and a tool of control. I'd be curious, do you have any recommended reading or things that you can point to and say, you should Google this, Google that?
No.
Yeah.
So I think one thing maybe I'll mention that we worked on in Arab urbanism recently. We published an issue called Imaginaries from a Blackout, and this came out a few months ago. And the contributors to that are people from all over the region, or working on the region, who wrote precisely about this question of how is infrastructure entangled with the political conditions and the social aspirations of people. And so it's, on the one hand, it's about the infrastructure of failure, of the many things we are seeing in our Arab cities. On the other hand, it's also about everyday experiences with this infrastructure, and how people overcome, invent new means, not because they want to be sustainable, but because they want to survive, actually. Yeah. The conversation we're having in the Arab region is very different than the conversation around, sustainability and climate change in the West, which comes from a much more luxurious standpoint, I think.
Yeah.
So this issue, I think, which is guest edited by Lana Jude and Muhammad Abu, both architects and scholars, I think is really worth looking into, because it talks about these things only historically, but what's happening in the present moment, from Beirut to Khartoum to Cairo, to the Maghreb. So I would say that would be
Can you say the name one more time?
So it's the latest issue of the Arab Urbanism magazine, which is called Imaginaries from a Black Hat.
Great.
And in Arabic, it's called لوين بتروح الكهرباء.
Yeah. The Arabic, the title's better.
Yeah, of course. Some things cannot be translated.
Yeah. It's like, it's not only the electricity. I mean, the stories of cholera coming out of Gaza, and it's really, really scary. Very, very scary, because the history of genocide is most often through that, right? This is the story of the Native Americans in the U.S. and most of the Western Hemisphere. And so, I mean, the major utilities, water, sewage, all of that is controlled entirely by Israel. Yeah.
And we're seeing the devastating effects of that in Gaza today. But of course, Israel has control over all these utilities throughout Palestine, like all the way from the Jordan Valley to Gaza. So it's important that people keep that in mind. That genocide sometimes is fast, sometimes includes direct massacres and direct murder of people. But in other instances, it's also slow. It's a slow process that is based on the full control of all resources of life, and prohibiting, in this case, Palestinians from accessing them.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about your upcoming book, which I'm sure is the last thing on your mind. But I think it's important to talk about it. So would you mind telling us a little bit about what the book is, and how it connects to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think the connection I'm going to draw is going to be a big tangent to the actual book. The book is titled Birth of a Profession, Arab Architects and the Making of the Modern Arab World.
Yeah, it's connected.
It's precisely, it's precisely about the thing we discussed earlier about, how the architecture profession emerges in the Arab region writ large. But the main thing, I think, that to me interests me in writing this is about regionalism, is about this question of relations between Arab countries, precisely at the moment that borders were being drawn between them. That these borders, which came mostly as a result of British and French colonial intervention in the region, did not prohibit Arabs from creating and forging methods of exchange and means of exchange. And I think that, to me, is the main question here, is how do we, as Arabs today, forge connections despite everything? I mean, we know our borders, we know our regimes, we know the difficulties, we know everything. But how do we have conversations that are not merely happening amongst ourselves within each of our, national territories, but regionally across the board? And I think this remains an incredible and important question. After the 1967 defeat, there was an Arab Engineering Congress that was held in Kuwait. And Arab Engineering Congresses date all the way back to 1945, and they're among the subjects of the book that I'm writing. And in this 1968 or 69 conference, which happened immediately after, engineers sort of dropped, including architects, dropped all the questions that are about technical issues, dropped everything. And the main question raised in that Congress was, how do we use our profession? How do we use these skills that we have, this knowledge that we have, in order to address the defeat of Arab states against Israel? This was the main question raised in that Congress. I think today, many decades later, I think that conversation is missing. It's definitely missing at the formal level, where the Arab League today is as dysfunctional as ever. But at least what we could do as people from the region who have different agendas, who obviously care about the welfare of the entire region, is to create these bonds and to raise these questions collectively. And I think that's probably the point I would wish to highlight in the present moment.
I love it. Nadi, thanks so much for joining us on a Saturday morning during a insanely tough time. I appreciate your thoughts and yeah. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.